The morning sun rose over the city like a golden crown, glinting off glass towers and wide ceremonial roads that had been closed for the day. Outside the grand venue, a line of luxury cars stretched as far as the eye could see, sleek black SUVs and polished sedans, their engines humming softly while drivers in crisp uniforms held doors open. Cameras flashed. Music swelled. Today was not just a wedding, it was an event meant to be remembered. Inside the open-air hall, wealth announced itself in every detail. Tall pillars were wrapped in rich fabrics of gold and deep crimson. Fresh flowers, hibiscus, lilies, and white roses, filled the air with a sweet, heady scent. Elite guests arrived dressed in regal African attire, flowing Kent cloth, embroidered agbatas, bold Ankara gowns adorned with beads and gold jewelry. Laughter rippled through the crowd as greetings were exchanged. "Only him," someone whispered with a smile. "Only a billionaire could do this." At the center stood the groom. Calm. Confident. Admired. His royal outfit shimmered under the lights, tailored to perfection, every stitch a symbol of power and success. He smiled easily, shaking hands, accepting praise as if he had been born to it. "You've done your family proud," an elder said, gripping his hand. The groom nodded respectfully. "Thank you. Today is a blessing." Nearby, the bride appeared, glowing as she stepped forward. Her dress blended modern elegance with tradition, beads woven into her hair, her smile soft but radiant. When she met the groom's eyes, the noise around them seemed to fade for a moment. Applause erupted as the guests turned to admire her. "This is what destiny looks like," someone murmured. The music slowed. The officiant cleared his throat. The crowd leaned in, buzzing with pride, not just for the couple, but for what they represented: success, legacy, triumph. This wedding was proof that dreams could rise from dust to diamonds. Yet, beyond the laughter and applause, beyond the cameras and champagne glasses, another world moved quietly along the edges of the celebration. Plates were carried. Floors were wiped. Trays were lifted and lowered without notice. Near the back, partially hidden behind towering decorations, a young maid paused for just a second. Her hands tightened around a silver tray. Her eyes, dark and heavy with something unspoken, were fixed on the groom. Quick pause for a note to viewers: if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for the next dramatic chapter. As the officiant raised his hand to begin the vows, the hall fell into a reverent hush. And in that silence, unseen by most, the maid took a small step forward, her heart pounding, her breath unsteady, toward the center of a wedding that was about to change forever. While the hall sparkled with golden chandeliers and the soft hum of orchestral music, one figure moved almost unnoticed among the sea of elegance. A young African maid wove through the crowd, her dark skin glistening faintly under the sunlight that streamed through the open windows. Her hands, small and calloused, trembled slightly as she balanced a tray heavy with glasses of sparkling juice and champagne. Every so often, she paused to wipe a spill on the polished marble floor, her movements quick but careful, almost ritualistic. No one looked at her twice. The guests were too busy adjusting their intricate Ankara outfits, whispering compliments about the bride, or taking pictures on sleek smartphones. The groom's laughter rang out from the center of the hall, echoing off the marble and high ceilings, yet it seemed a world away from her reality. The maid's eyes, dark and full of unspoken pain, followed the luxurious procession of wealth around her. Every sparkling necklace, every embroidered gown, every laughter-filled toast reminded her of the life she was born into, and the life she had never been allowed to claim. She swallowed a lump in her throat, blinking back tears that threatened to fall, and adjusted the tray again. "Watch your step," muttered a guest as he nearly bumped into her. She nodded, murmuring a soft, almost inaudible, "Yes, sir," and moved along. No one thanked her. No one smiled. Her presence was as invisible as the gentle breeze flowing through the open windows, unnoticed despite the flurry of her efforts. She paused by a grand pillar and leaned for a moment, just enough to catch her breath. Through the carved patterns in the wood, she caught a glimpse of the bride laughing at a joke, the groom offering a glass to an elderly uncle, guests clapping in admiration. It all looked like a dream, vivid, beautiful, untouchable. Yet, behind the sparkling facade, she carried a weight that none of them could see, years of struggle, of rejection, of being overlooked simply because of her status. "Careful, miss," whispered a fellow maid who passed with a stack of plates. The young maid nodded with a faint, exhausted smile, gripping the tray tighter as if it were her lifeline. Her heart pounded in a mix of anxiety and determination. She had come here for this day, for this moment, and though she was invisible to all, she was quietly gathering courage. As the music softened, and the crowd's attention began to focus on the groom for the ceremonial vows, she straightened her back. Her dark eyes glimmered with a spark that no gold could rival, a spark of defiance, of truth ready to step out of the shadows. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew, this was not just another day of serving drinks or wiping floors. Something was about to happen that would make the entire hall, and everyone in it, look at her, finally, and pay attention. And with that thought, she took a small but deliberate step forward, letting the silence of anticipation settle like a heavy curtain across the grand hall. The music swelled to a soft crescendo as the priest raised his hands to begin the vows. Sunlight glinted off golden ornaments, and the fragrant scent of fresh jasmine and hibiscus hung in the air. Guests leaned forward in their seats, eyes fixed on the couple, the billionaire groom standing tall in his royal African igbata, the bride radiant in her beaded gown, her eyes shimmering with anticipation. Everything seemed perfect, orchestrated to the last detail. But then, silence broke. A small, determined figure emerged from the periphery. The maid, previously invisible and ignored, stepped forward from the shadows of the grand pillars. Her hands, still gripping the silver tray she had carried for hours, were now clenched into fists. Her dark eyes blazed with an intensity that no wealth, no laughter, no camera flashes could diminish. "Stop this wedding," she shouted, her voice cutting through the hall like thunder. The music screeched to a halt. Glasses rattled slightly on trays. Gasps erupted like a storm. Guests froze mid-gesture, their murmurs dissolving into stunned silence. The officiant's hand faltered in mid-air, eyes wide behind his spectacles. The groom's jaw tightened, a rare flicker of confusion crossing his composed face. The bride blinked, a question forming in her lips as her hands clutched the folds of her gown. "Who, what?" whispered a shocked guest, their voice trembling. The maid took another step forward, her voice rising slightly, shaking with both fear and conviction. "You cannot do this. This wedding is built on lies." She hesitated for just a heartbeat, the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. "You must listen before it's too late." For a moment, it seemed as if the world had paused. The golden sunlight streaming through the windows illuminated the maid's face, highlighting the sweat on her brow and the fierce determination in her eyes. She was small, perhaps powerless in the eyes of the elite, but in this instant, she carried the weight of truth. The guests exchanged shocked glances. Some whispered furiously, while others held their hands to their mouths in disbelief. The groom's expression shifted from irritation to tension, a faint crease forming between his brows. The bride's smile faltered. Cameras, once flashing for the perfect moment, now swung toward the maid, capturing her defiance. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple, but she did not step back. The hall, once alive with celebration, now vibrated with tension. Every eye was on her. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to pause as the invisible maid, ignored for so long, finally demanded to be seen. In that pregnant silence, one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The story of this wedding, and the lives entwined within it, was about to change forever. And as the guests stared, frozen between shock and disbelief, the maid braced herself. The moment she had been waiting for, the truth finally finding its voice, was only just beginning. For a heartbeat, the hall remained suspended in stunned silence, every eye locked on the small figure of the maid who had dared to speak out. Then, like a sudden crack of thunder, laughter erupted. "Oh, look at her," a guest sneered, waving a manicured hand. "Does she even know what she's saying?" Others followed, chuckling, some nearly spilling their drinks as they pointed and whispered. The rich, the powerful, the celebrated, they all laughed at her audacity, their amusement sharp, cutting through the quiet dignity she tried to maintain. The maid's jaw clenched. Her hands, still trembling slightly, hung at her sides, empty now, as if the tray she had carried for hours had symbolically dropped the weight of her patience onto the polished marble floor. She could feel their eyes like knives, dissecting her presence, reminding her that in their world, she was nothing more than a shadow. "Security. Please remove her immediately," a wealthy aunt demanded, waving toward the two uniformed guards standing nearby. Their polished shoes clicked against the floor as they advanced, eyes fixed on the maid like predators sizing up prey. "Step aside," one guard barked, reaching toward her shoulder. The maid flinched, but her dark eyes, burning with defiance, did not look away. The groom, standing tall moments before, shifted uneasily. His perfectly tailored agbada crinkled slightly as he stepped back, a frown creasing his forehead. Embarrassment flickered across his otherwise composed features. He adjusted his cufflinks, a nervous gesture that betrayed his growing irritation. "What is this nonsense?" he muttered, barely audible, yet it carried across the tense room. His voice was calm but sharp, the tone of a man unused to being challenged, especially not by someone of such low standing. But the maid did not retreat. Instead, she straightened, drawing herself up just enough to meet the gaze of those laughing at her. She could feel the heat of humiliation pressing down on her, yet beneath it all was a fire, a stubborn, relentless need to speak the truth. The guests continued to murmur, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering among themselves with a mix of curiosity and scorn. The bride, clutching her bouquet, watched silently, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. The music had stopped entirely, leaving only the sound of soft whispers, the occasional nervous cough, and the faint echo of heels on marble. In that room, the invisible had become visible, but the price of speaking up was immediate: ridicule, fear, and the looming presence of authority. And yet, as the security guards inched closer, she stood her ground, aware that her next words could change everything, or seal her humiliation forever. The laughter, the sneers, the disbelief, it was all a storm pressing down upon her. But the maid inhaled deeply, steadying herself, knowing that what she had to say next could shatter the illusions that wealth and power had built around this wedding. And somewhere deep within the hall, a hush began to form, almost imperceptible at first, as if the air itself was waiting for the truth to rise. The laughter had faded slightly, replaced by an uneasy silence. The music was gone, the golden sunlight now feeling heavier, almost oppressive. The maid's small figure stood in the center of the grand hall, but her voice, though trembling, rang with authority. She took a deep breath, the scent of jasmine and roses filling her senses, mingling with the nervous energy of the crowd. "You must listen," she began, her voice low but steady, carrying across the room. "I am not here to humiliate anyone, but this wedding, this celebration you all admire, it is built on lies." The guests stiffened. A few murmured nervously. Even the bride, radiant moments ago, froze mid-step, her bouquet clutched tightly. The groom's eyes narrowed, disbelief flickering into irritation. He opened his mouth, but she held up a hand, stopping him before he could speak. "Do not interrupt me," she said firmly, her dark eyes blazing. "Everything you see here, the pomp, the smiles, the wealth, it cannot hide the truth. If you go through with this wedding, the lies will be exposed. And when that happens, it will destroy everything you think you have, your reputation, your family, even your name." The hall seemed to hold its breath. The chandelier's crystals refracted sunlight into sharp prisms on the marble floor, highlighting the tension in every face. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging worried glances. The silence was broken only by the faint rustle of fabric and the soft shuffle of heels. The groom's jaw tightened. "Who are you to speak of lies?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp, laced with both authority and panic. "Do you think you can just—" His words faltered as he struggled to maintain control over a room now hanging on the maid's every word. "I am someone who has seen the truth," she replied, her voice trembling now with a mix of fear and urgency. "Someone who knows what has been hidden. You may call me a servant, a nobody, but I know the truth of your past, the truth of this wedding, and I swear, if you continue, you will regret it more than anything in your life." Her words landed like stones on a calm lake, rippling outward through the crowd. The bride's smile vanished entirely, replaced by uncertainty and fear. The groom's hands clenched into fists at his sides, the veins in his neck standing out as the weight of her warning pressed against his carefully constructed world. For a long, tense moment, the hall was still. The maid's breathing was steadying, but her pulse raced. Every eye was on her now, no longer ignoring the invisible servant in the corner. And in that silence an unspoken understanding began to form, the truth had arrived. Somewhere deep inside the groom, a flicker of recognition sparked, as if her words had pierced a memory long buried. The moment had arrived, the wedding would no longer be just a celebration. Something far greater, far more devastating, was about to unfold. And as the guests leaned forward, waiting, the maid's dark eyes scanned the room, full of resolve. She had spoken her warning. Now, all that remained was the reaction, the unraveling of everything the wealthy had built. The hall had fallen into a tense, suffocating silence. The guests watched in stunned awe, but for the groom, the sound of the maid's voice echoed far beyond the marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Something about the way she spoke, the firmness in her words, sent a chill crawling up his spine. His eyes widened slightly, the lines of control on his face faltering. He blinked, and suddenly the golden hall dissolved into shadows of memory, flickering images from a time he had tried to bury deep within him. He saw a small, dusty village on the outskirts of the city, narrow dirt paths winding between clay homes, the smell of roasted maize and wet earth hanging in the air. A woman, young, worn from hardship, her hands raw from labor, was pleading with him. Her voice trembled, laced with desperation and fear. "Please, don't leave me. Please." A little girl, no older than 5, clutched the woman's skirt, her tiny face streaked with tears. The groom remembered the way he had turned away, too blinded by ambition, too eager to chase wealth and power, leaving behind the very life he had created. He had promised care, protection, a future, yet walked away, shrouding it in silence and shame. The sound of the maid's voice in the present snapped him further. He froze, recognition flooding him like a sudden, cold rain. The words, the tone, the cadence, it all matched the voice of that woman's daughter. His chest tightened. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He could feel the weight of years pressing down, every lie, every avoidance, every decision coming back to confront him. The room around him, the opulent hall, the applauding guests, the bride's shocked expression, faded at the edges of his vision. His past, the betrayal, the abandoned child, all became painfully vivid. The memory of the child's frightened eyes, the soft sobs muffled against the woman's chest, surged forward, impossible to ignore. He whispered under his breath, almost to himself, it can't be." His voice trembled. "No, it can't be her." The maid, standing firm in the present, did not flinch. Her dark eyes held his, unwavering, unafraid. And in that gaze, he saw the child he had left behind, now grown, strong, and unyielding. The guests noticed the sudden tension in the groom, his shoulders stiffened, his usual composure cracking. A flicker of unease crossed their faces. Something deep, something he had tried to hide for years, had surfaced in a heartbeat. The air in the hall seemed heavier now, charged with suspense. The wealth, the grandeur, the laughter, they all felt distant, irrelevant. The past had caught up, and with it, the truth that would soon shatter the illusion of this perfect wedding. Somewhere, at the edge of his mind, a silent dread took root. The wedding could no longer proceed as planned. The story had shifted, and the groom now understood, the reckoning was inevitable. The hall, still echoing with the maid's warning, seemed to hold its breath. Every eye was fixed on her, every heartbeat in the room synchronized to the quiet storm she carried in her gaze. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into the pocket of her worn African dress and pulled out a small, folded bundle. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and incense, yet now it seemed heavy, saturated with anticipation. The guests leaned forward. The billionaire groom's eyes narrowed, his perfect composure fraying at the edges. What is that?" he asked, his voice low, tense, almost a growl. The maid unfolded the bundle with steady hands, revealing photographs and documents, yellowed with age but unmistakably genuine. Images of a younger version of the groom, standing beside a poor woman in a humble village, smiling awkwardly while a small child clung to her skirt. Birth certificates, letters, and faded notes confirmed what the pictures whispered: the child he had abandoned, the life he had ignored, the consequences of choices he thought were long buried. She held the papers up high for all to see. "This is the truth," she said, her voice calm but cutting through the chatter like a knife. "I am your daughter, left behind all those years ago. The life you turned your back on, the promises you abandoned. I am living proof." A gasp ran through the hall like a wave. The bride's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Guests whispered among themselves, fear and disbelief mingling in their voices. Even the seasoned elite, accustomed to wealth and influence, froze, unable to mask the astonishment painted across their faces. The groom staggered back a step, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. His eyes darted between the documents and the maid, struggling to process the reality that had been thrust before him. "No, this can't be," he stammered, the room spinning around him. His voice cracked, a rare vulnerability seeping through his meticulously controlled demeanor. The maid took another step forward, her dark eyes unwavering. "It is," she said softly. "And now you see that your decisions, your lies, and your neglect have consequences. I am here, and the truth can no longer be hidden." Silence descended. The laughter, the whispers, the clinking of glasses, all vanished, replaced by a heavy, almost tangible stillness. The chandelier crystals glinted in the sunlight, casting fractured rainbows across faces frozen in shock. Some guests averted their eyes, others stared, unable to look away. The weight of revelation pressed on every shoulder, every heart. In that moment, the hall was no longer a celebration. It had become a courtroom, a stage, and a confessional all at once. And standing at the center, small but unyielding, the maid, once invisible, was now the axis upon which the truth pivoted. The groom's face paled, his carefully curated world unraveling in seconds. He could feel the eyes of everyone upon him, the weight of every choice he had ever made bearing down like a storm. The wedding, the wealth, the power, it all seemed meaningless now in the face of a single, undeniable truth. And somewhere, in the silence that followed, the first tremors of reckoning began to ripple through the grand hall. The silence hung heavy in the grand hall, thicker than any fabric draped over the golden pillars. Guests shifted uncomfortably, whispering in hushed tones, their eyes darting between the groom and the maid. The luxurious chandeliers above reflected fractured light across the marble floor, catching glimpses of shock, fear, and disbelief in every face. The music had long stopped, replaced by the low murmur of astonishment, as if the hall itself were holding its breath. The bride stood frozen for a moment, her bouquet trembling in her hands. Her smile, which had once radiated joy and excitement, vanished completely. She took a step back, her heels clicking softly against the marble, then another. Slowly, deliberately, she turned away from the groom, her eyes avoiding his. I can't," she whispered, barely audible, her voice trembling. Then, without another word, she walked toward the exit, the fabric of her elaborate gown swishing softly, leaving a trail of stunned silence behind her. Gasps echoed through the hall as the guests followed her with their eyes. Some whispered judgments, others shook their heads in disbelief. The groom, who had always commanded respect and admiration, froze, staring at the retreating figure of his bride. His hands, once steady and confident, trembled. His chest heaved with shallow breaths as the reality of the collapse pressed upon him like a tidal wave. "No, this isn't happening," he muttered, his voice cracking. This can't be true." But it was true. The photos, the documents, the revelations, the truth that had erupted into the hall moments before, had shattered the carefully curated image of wealth, power, and perfection he had spent years building. Every handshake, every smile, every congratulatory toast now felt hollow. The opulence around him, the crystal chandeliers, the golden accents, the elaborate decor, was meaningless in the face of exposed lies. Guests shifted uneasily, whispering amongst themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others covering their mouths to hide gasps of astonishment. The buzz of gossip filled the air, like bees circling a hive disturbed, as everyone processed the dramatic fall of a man who had seemed untouchable. The groom sank to a nearby chair, his fingers gripping the arms tightly, knuckles white. His usually proud posture crumbled, his head hung low. For the first time, the room saw vulnerability, the raw, human reaction of a man confronting the consequences of his actions. His public image, once pristine and untouchable, lay in tatters before the eyes of everyone he had hoped to impress. Outside, the sun continued to stream through the windows, glinting off the polished marble, indifferent to the ruin of grandeur and reputation inside. And in the center of it all, the groom sat broken, surrounded by whispers and judgment, as the once celebrated wedding became a cautionary tale of lies, neglect, and betrayal. The story of this day was no longer about celebration, it was about reckoning, and the consequences of a life built on deception were now unavoidable. The grand hall, once alive with laughter and clinking glasses, now felt empty, its golden chandeliers casting long, fractured shadows across the marble floors. The whispers of guests lingered like distant echoes, but the maid stood tall, her dark eyes unwavering, the weight of truth finally settled in the room. The groom, slumped in his chair, looked up at her with a mixture of awe, disbelief, and shame. She stepped closer, her worn African dress swishing softly with each measured step. "I have spoken the truth," she said, her voice steady and calm, resonating with the quiet authority of someone who had endured years of hardship. "Everything else, your money, your titles, your power, it doesn't matter to me." The groom's hands trembled. I can give you anything," he stammered, his pride clashing with the desperation in his eyes. "Money, land, your own home, anything you want." She shook her head slowly, her braided hair catching the sunlight that streamed through the tall windows. "No," she replied softly but firmly. "I do not want your wealth. I do not want your power. I do not want your status. I only wanted one thing, for the truth to be known. That is enough." A hush settled over the room as the weight of her words sank in. The crowd, still lingering on the edges of the hall, watched silently. Some eyes glistened with tears, others were wide with astonishment. She could have demanded anything, luxury, influence, vengeance, but she had chosen something far more powerful, dignity and moral victory. The groom's face twisted with regret. I don't know how to make this right," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I failed you, and I failed myself." The maid took a step back, her expression softening, yet her stance remained proud. "You can't undo the past," she said gently. "But you can start by acknowledging it, learning from it, and changing the path you take from here. That is all I ask." Outside the hall, the late afternoon sun painted the city skyline with warm golds and soft oranges. The distant hum of the marketplace, the calls of vendors, and the faint laughter of children from nearby streets reminded her of life beyond wealth and pretension. Her journey had not been about luxury or fame, it had been about justice, truth, and the courage to stand for what was right. The groom sank into silence, the enormity of her forgiveness pressing on him. He realized, in that moment, that this small maid, once invisible, overlooked, underestimated, had shown him a strength he could never buy. She had claimed victory not through riches, but through integrity. As she turned to leave, the light caught her face, highlighting determination, pride, and a quiet triumph. She walked toward a life of her own making, leaving behind the glittering hall, the shattered illusions, and a lesson that no wealth could ever replace: truth and dignity are the most powerful legacies of all. Months had passed since the day the grand hall erupted with truth, and life had quietly shifted for those involved. The maid, now free from the weight of invisibility and injustice, walked through the narrow streets of her neighborhood with a sense of purpose. The city around her buzzed with energy, street vendors called out in melodic rhythms, children raced along dusty alleys, and the scent of fresh bread and roasted corn filled the air. Her small home, modest but warm, stood on a sunlit corner where the walls were painted in cheerful colors, a stark contrast to the cold opulence she had once served. She had built a life of her own choosing. Every morning, she tended to a tiny garden of hibiscus and marigolds, their vibrant petals swaying in the gentle breeze. She laughed freely now, a sound that had been silenced for years, sharing stories with neighbors and friends who treated her as an equal, not a servant. Her dark eyes, once clouded with fear and invisibility, now sparkled with confidence and peace. Meanwhile, the groom sat alone in the towering apartment he had once called a palace. The golden chandeliers, polished floors, and luxury furnishings now felt hollow. Each photograph of his former life, each framed accolade, seemed to mock him silently. He replayed the maid's revelation in his mind, her calm strength, the documents that exposed the past, the dignity with which she refused his wealth. His pride had crumbled, and regret lingered like a shadow in every corner of the room. He had learned, painfully, that no amount of money or power could erase wrongdoing or buy redemption. The narrator's voice emerges, soft but firm, carrying a gentle reminder. In a world that often values wealth over character, it is easy to forget that every life holds its own story, unseen and untold. Judging others by status, appearance, or fortune is a mistake, one that can cost more than pride or wealth ever could. Back in her neighborhood, the maid paused at the gate of her small home and looked out at the city skyline in the distance. She breathed in the warm afternoon air, feeling the pulse of life around her, alive and vibrant. She had no titles, no riches, no influence, but she had something far more powerful: integrity, truth, and the freedom to live life on her own terms. And as the sun dipped low, casting golden light across the rooftops and streets, one thing was clear: the lesson of that day, the courage to speak, the choice to stand for truth, and the value of dignity, would echo far beyond the halls of a grand wedding. It was a lesson no one would forget. The maid stepped inside her home, closing the door gently behind her, leaving the world to reflect on what truly matters, while she began her next chapter, grounded, fearless, and free.